Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David. Thank you. And it's really nice to be in front of you today. I'm really sorry that you may be tired. I hope I won't be bothering too much. As David was saying, I moved from mathematics and physics to basically political economy, to Middle East studies. So I'm based at the University of Exeter in the UK. We have there a center dedicated to Gulf studies, to the studies of the Gulf Monarchies. It's been established at the end of the 70s, and I was the director of it for 10 years. So now I'm not anymore the director of it. But there is a cluster of people working on the Gulf Monarchies there. So what I want to talk to you about today is, is about the 6 monarchies that we usually consider the Gulf monarchies, and especially the economic challenges that they have been facing. So what I will do for, let's say, 10-15 minutes is basically present the kind of economic model that they have been relying on for several decades, and basically the role of oil in their economic model, and especially also in the political legitimacy of these rulers and these monarchies. And I'll show that a number of problems and challenges, structural challenges have been emerging. And so I'll discuss these economic challenges, and I'll discuss the kind of solutions that these monarchies have been trying to find. But as you will see, I'm quite skeptical about the way how they have been dealing with these structural challenges. So basically, I'll talk about Saudi Arabia and the 5 monarchies which are smaller Gulf monarchies, so Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Oman. Right? A number of the things that I'll talk about today can be extended to a certain extent to countries like Iraq, Iran, or other other oil producers in the region like Algeria or Libya. So, a few key facts. Without looking at the ruling families, what is important to keep in mind first is that they are extremely recent countries and extremely recent monarchies. So Saudi Arabia has been independent since 1932, but the other 5 countries are even more recent and were granted independence by the British and the British Empire. So what's interesting to note is that none of these monarchies and rulers has fought for independence. So that's quite important. They were granted independence by the British. A few comparative statistics. As you'll see, in terms of national population, these are relatively small countries. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has 22 million nationals. This is an estimate because there are no censuses. So Saudi Arabia is estimated 22 million in nationals, compared to Iraq, 45 million, Iran, 88, Yemen, 32. And when you look at the smaller Gulf monarchies, you can see that they are extremely small countries in terms of nationals. For instance, Qatar has basically a population of 300,000 inhabitants, national. So 300,000, right? And in addition to that, of course, in all these Gulf monarchies, you have a very substantial non-national population inhabiting these countries. Again, there is an estimate of approximately 13 million foreigners living in Saudi Arabia, so 1/3 of the total residing population. And in countries like Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, you have probably 8 to 9 times more foreigners than nationals residing in these monarchies. So in Qatar, for instance, we can estimate that only 10%, 12% of the nationals, of the population residing in Qatar is composed of nationals. So as you can imagine, there are plenty of impacts that we can discuss, we can talk about this in the discussion, but plenty of impacts in terms of political legitimacy, relation with the rulers, state-society relations, because when you are a tiny minority in your own country, it has an impact on the way how you, relate to the ruler, and vice versa. A few key facts also in terms of oil production. Among the top 10 oil producers in the world, Saudi Arabia is the second. United Arab Emirates is here, and Kuwait is here. So all these countries are in the top 15 oil producers at the moment. And in terms of reserves, oil reserves, Saudi Arabia has the second oil reserves in the world. They're behind Venezuela. Iraq and Iran have substantial reserves also, and Kuwait and United Arab Emirates are also among the top countries in the world for oil reserves. I was talking about oil reserves only. When you talk about natural gas, this is quite similar. And what is particularly noticeable is that Qatar has the third gas reserves in the world. So with such a tiny population, they control 1/3 of the total gas reserves in the world. So Qatar is not much, it's partly an oil producer, but mainly a gas producer. I won't go into history, just to say that this is a map of the first oil discoveries in the region. Just to notice that the oil discoveries have not taken place at the same time. So there has been quite a lot of time spread in terms of discovery of oil. So for instance, oil was discovered in what is now Iran by the very beginning of the 20th century. In Saudi Arabia, it was only in the late 30s. And in countries like the United Arab Emirates, it's only in the 50s, Oman in the 60s. So you have quite an important time gap between all these countries in terms of oil discovery, which has an impact also on the political activity and political activism and state-society relations in these countries. So when we study the Gulf Monarchies from a political economy perspective, we tend to rely on, or to consider them as rentier states. So a rentier state is defined, usually in political economy literature, you may know about that, as a state whose revenues derive predominantly from a rent or from a foreign source. When we say predominantly, that's 40 to 50% at least of the state revenues coming from this particular rent. Then a number of these, Gulf countries are considered as rentier states according to these definitions, because 60 to 75% of the state revenues in the Gulf Monarchies derive from hydrocarbons. Algeria, it's 50% at the moment, and Iraq, 85%. But you have also countries like Algeria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, but also diamond, Botswana can be considered as a rentier state due to its reliance on the exploitation of diamond for the state revenues, right? The impact, what is quite important to say first is that we tend to see these countries or this region as a historical region, so a region without history, without people, without political activism. So we always talk about what happens politically in Egypt, in Israel, Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in North Africa. But when you talk about Gulf monarchies, you usually have in mind countries which are quite stable, where there is not much political activism, not much political history, and not much, dissent and political divisions. And that's a big problem because it relies, it has to do with the way how these countries have been presenting themselves for a long time in terms of official history of these countries. So trying to erase as much as possible the actual history and the actual descent within the country. But also it comes from academics and many observers who have been for a long time feeding into this approach, feeding into this narrative that before oil there was nothing, or there was, I mean, we were talking about supposedly nomadic tribes who had basically very little political history, political activism. So this kind of Orientalist narrative. And suddenly from oil, when oil was discovered, suddenly they became extremely rich, and without any political activity at all, because with oil, that was a way for these rulers to buy off consent among the nationals. So I'll try to show you how this narrative has been spread and all the limits of these problems and what we see at the moment. So thanks to these massive revenues, the state or the ruling families have tried to buy legitimacy at home, so through a number of means and tools, including welfare programs, and I will detail that now. So a few examples of these tools or these policies of oil redistribution in these countries, which have been used by the rulers to try to appease and buy off consent or buy consent. The first one is that there is very limited or usually no tax on individual incomes in these Gulf monarchies. So as a national, you don't pay any income tax. And it's the case for many foreigners also in these countries. There have been heavy subsidies on petrol, water, heavy electricity prices, but only for nationals. So that was a very important tool in order to make sure that the rulers were explaining to the population, look, you as nationals are benefiting from these oil revenues, and not the foreigners, not the expatriates which are living in your country. So that was a very important tool to divide and to make sure that there was a clear division between nationals and expatriates. So heavy subsidies on petrol, water, electricity prices, even some food prices. For instance, in Qatar, Qatari nationals don't pay electricity and water at all. That's fully free for Qatari nationals. Of course, not for expatriates in Qatar. Free education for nationals. Free healthcare for nationals. I mean, there have been some amendments recently with some fiscal crisis taking place, but globally speaking, it's very cheap. And especially, I mean, even some countries are sending their nationals abroad and fully, supporting financially this medical trips to Thailand, to Europe, when the nationals cannot be treated at home, for instance, when there is no facility for these particular treatments. So the state will support and fund 100% of it. There have been provision of government housing and free lands to the nationals. And there have been a lot of rulers' gifts. So basically, the rulers, on special occasions, quite frequently, showing their benevolence. I'm using it ironically, but it's the term. Showing their benevolence to the national population as father of the nations, showing that and in trying to reinforce the belonging of the nationals to the national community, and especially showing that that this national community, under the umbrella of this father of the nation, is united and so on. There has been also a heavy saturation of the public sector in these countries by both civil and military sector, by the creation of many jobs for nationals within this civil and military sector, so providing public sector jobs to nationals, again, to show the nationals, look, the state is redistributing the oil rent through salaries to you, and the state is so benevolent and is here to make you happy, right? And also the kafala system, you heard about it probably, the sponsorship system, the fact that all foreigners and expatriates who work in these countries have to benefit, have to have a sponsor, a local sponsor, a national, who is their sponsor. And their sponsor, whether you are an employee or whether you want to establish a business in these countries, this sponsor will, for instance, if you establish a business, will control at least 51% of the company stock that you are establishing in this country, right? So that's, again, the nationals, in a way, will serve as a gateway for all businesses entering the market. And that's, again, a way, that's a rent, because the very fact that you are a national will give you the possibility to sponsor as many companies or as many foreigners as you like. So that's another way of showing the difference, the very difference between being a national and being an expatriate, right? In addition to this, what I can say, universal redistribution of the rent towards nationals, you also have some mechanisms of very specific individualized favors granted to a number of key elements of the society that the ruler will consider particularly important for the stability of their rule. So some individuals, and especially the business elite in most of these countries, but also tribal leaders, will benefit, in addition to all the kind of universal redistribution that I mentioned before, to some particular benefits granted to them as individuals. And for instance, when we talk about the modernization of these countries, so the creation of infrastructure, the creation of roads, schools, health centers, all these kind of construction contracts, they will, of course, these public contracts funded by the state will, of course, be granted to this particular business elite companies or the tribal leaders who have established companies especially for that. And so they will benefit massively for these huge public contracts. And that's another way to redistribute the rent, the oil rent, by making sure that these particular sectors of the society are disproportionately benefiting from the situation and then have absolutely no interest in challenging it. So, based on that, there is a theory which has been established, a political theory, trying to establish a link between the revenues of the state and the political system. So trying to explain that a country which is benefiting from such a big oil rent or oil resources will very likely remain or be authoritarian and remain authoritarian. Why? Because according to the theory, rentier states are not expected to democratize as long as they remain rentier. As long as the state is in a situation where they can redistribute oil rent, when it can redistribute oil rent through multiple tools and schemes, it's unlikely that nationals will, according to the theory, of course, it's unlikely that the national will challenge the situation because they benefit from all this redistribution. So these countries or these countries don't need democratic legitimation in a way, according to the theory. There is already a lot of legitimacy to the ruler, these rulers being presented as the father of the nation, the benevolent fathers of the nation. So what would we need a democratic legitimacy in these cases? And the only situation when in fact, rentier states could, according to the theory, be in a difficulty would be if they are confronted with a fiscal crisis. So in a situation where they are not in a situation anymore to redistribute this oil rent to the population through various means. So the fiscal crisis of the state may be then an important incentive for democratization, because then people will not be happy, the population will not be happy, and they will call for political representation or for amendment to the system. There are plenty of limitations of the theory, and based on this, I'll show the kind of current major challenges that these countries are facing. The first one is that it's a very static, very rigid approach. The state in this, according to his theory, is considered as homogeneous, as a black box, And the theory doesn't say anything about what happens within the system, within the ruling family, right? So that's a really problematic theory from a political perspective, because we don't understand what happens within this political system. The second thing is that it's premised, as I said just before, as on a selective reading of the past. Because it's based on the idea that there was absolutely nothing in these countries before oil was exploited, and suddenly with oil, everything changed, and suddenly everybody was happy, and everything is fine, and that can explain the stability of these countries. The problem is that this was a region where you had the British Empire controlling the region. So this theory doesn't say anything about the role of the British Empire and the legacy of the British Empire in this region. As I said, the British granted independence to these ruling families. So these ruling families didn't fight for independence. They were just granted the position of leadership. And it comforts the ideologies of these regimes themselves, which try to present themselves towards the world as a place of stability, a place where nothing happens, where there is no dissent, compared to what happens in Egypt, in Palestine, in Syria, in neighboring countries. So by showing, look, we are reliable partners internationally. Another problem is that it's deterministic and tends to neglect the existence of counterexamples. There are counterexamples. For instance, Iraq in 1958 was an oil-producing country. And the monarchy in Iraq was overthrown by popular protest. The same in Libya in 1969. So there are examples of monarchies which were rich and which were overthrown by political movements. So this idea that as long as you are in a financially stable situation, you are safe as a ruler, there are counterexamples. And of course, there are examples of countries which are rentier at the moment and which are democratic. Norway is a great example. Norway is one of the most transparent, most accountable countries in the world, and Norway is a rentier state. 80% of its revenues come from the North Sea, the oil in the North Sea. But we have examples of Nigeria also. We have examples of Indonesia. So there are examples of countries which are democratic, or where there are alternation in the political system, but where with oil rent. And last but not least, it relies exclusively on the tax hypothesis. So this idea that if people are not taxed, then they would have no reason to protest also. But in fact, what happened with the Arab uprisings in 2011 showed the contrary. In 2011, these monarchies were in a very financial and a healthy economic situation. The price of the barrel of oil was above $100 a barrel, at least 90, and usually, across the year, $100 a barrel. So they had absolutely no financial problems. And despite that, we saw major protests taking place in Kuwait. We saw major protests taking place in Bahrain. We saw major protests taking place in Saudi Arabia. So people went to the street, not necessarily because they were taxed or because the state was not in a situation where it could not redistribute the oil rent, but because people were going to the street for social justice, for freedom of expression, for fight against corruption. So things which are not taken into account by this rentier state theory. And just an example, this is 2011 in Bahrain. This is the main roundabout in the capital of Bahrain. And this is one of the main protests on the 22nd of February. There were probably, we estimate that there were 20% of the total population, total Bahraini population in the street on the same day, 20%, right? That's unprecedented, and that's, there is no equal element in any country of the world. So, based on that, a number of old recipes to preserve this authoritarian system have not been or were not as efficient as they had been. The first one is, as I said, the reliance on the oil rent to buy off consent, or at least to make people unwilling to oppose the regime. As I said, 2011 was a counterexample. That was, I mean, this strategy, reliance on oil rent and oil redistribution, was not working. The second, strategy was the blackmailing strategy. Many Gulf monarchies have been saying to their nationals, look, the mess or the chaos in Yemen, look at the chaos in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt. You don't want to be in such a position, right? So basically, they were telling their population, this is either me, as ruler, or the chaos, as you can see around, if you go to the street and you start a revolution. But this was not a strategy that worked anymore. In 2011, people went to the street. The other one is the political economic segregation related to the kafala system, this idea that you are privileged because you are a national compared to all these foreigners in the country. In Qatar, 90% of the residing population is foreign. So let's imagine that as a ruler, I decide to open naturalization to a number of these nationals. The oil cake will remain the same, but it will have to be divided between many more people, right? So you have absolutely no interest in going to the street and in fighting against the current situation or in challenging this current situation, because what I could do is that I could reduce your share of the oil cake by opening naturalization to many foreigners. And this blackmailing strategy has not worked either. The rhetoric according to which reforms, political liberalization come at their own pace. You know, that's a very Orientalist and common rhetorics that we find with the idea that, you know, these countries are not as developed as others. They are not as accustomed as others to democratic processes, right? So democracy will come, but at its own pace, right? It will take more time for various reasons. And this very Orientalist and culturalist approach has not worked either, because people were not happy with that and were going to the street for, very basic democratic and political demands, which were not materialistic, but they were about political freedom and political justice and social justice. And the idea also that politics is a dangerous game. I've not talked about repression, but repression is extremely tough against any dissonant voices in these countries. So the regimes have been promoting the idea that as long as you don't talk about politics, nothing will happen to you. You will have a great life and everything will be fine for you. As soon as you talk about politics, even a minor thing, then it can be problematic for you. So politics is a dangerous game. That was the idea of a number of these regimes. And again, people went to the street despite this narrative of the regimes. So what are the structural challenges that these countries have been facing? And which can be related to, things that I discussed about the Arab uprisings. The first one is that more than 50% of the population in these countries, as it is the case across the Middle East in general, is below 24. So extremely young countries in terms of demographics. I will show you, For instance, in Saudi Arabia, so 50% are under 30 or under 24 sometimes, depending on the figures. And in Saudi Arabia, even 25% of the population is under 15. So you have a huge, very big generations of people who are now between 10 and 20, who are coming to the job market, who have been educated, and who are in a very different minds compared to their previous generations. Very educated young population, and especially very high proportion of females in higher education. I won't go into much detail in that, but you will have this slide. What is quite interesting is that this line is a gender parity between male and female, so a parity between male and female in higher education system. So if you are above this line, there is disparity at the expense of males. So basically, there are many more females in higher education than females. And when you look, this is all the countries in the world, and when you look at the Gulf Monarchies and most Middle East countries, there is a high disparity at the expense of males. So, for instance, in Qatar, you have 12 times more females at the university than males, 12 times. In Saudi Arabia, this is between 2 and 3 times more females at the university than males. And what is interesting is that we are talking not only about registration, but we are talking about graduation. In graduation, it's even more important. The gap is even more important. So females are even more successful at graduating and higher education than males in most of these countries. So not only they are more important in numbers, but they are more important. They are, more successful. Nationals, absolutely. Because in all universities in the Gulf, foreigners cannot be registered. So foreigners cannot register in public sector, public universities or universities funded by the state. They can register in foreign branches of branches of foreign universities, for instance, Sorbonne Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. But they cannot, foreigners cannot register in, universities funded by the state. Youth unemployment. High youth unemployment. We have in mind the countries which are extremely rich. In fact, there is an average percentage of 30% of unemployment among the youth that is between 18 and 30 or 15 and 24, depending on the figures. And it has been increasing still. So for instance, in Saudi Arabia, you can see that just below 30%, this is the unemployment youth as a share of the youth population. So that's just below 30%. And even in smaller monarchies like Kuwait, you can see that 15% of the youth is unemployed. So issues about unemployment among the youth and poverty. Poverty is ingrained among nationals. We have this idea again that all nationals may be rich. This is absolutely not the case. You have vast disparities between nationals. For instance, estimates show that 1 million people live in slums in towns like Jeddah or Mecca, that is the holy sites in Saudi Arabia, the holy sites of Islam. And about 70 slums in Mecca make up 25% of the city's urban space. So basically 25% of the holy city of Mecca for Islam is composed of slums. There are massive inequalities related to that among nationals. I am talking about nationals. When you look at the Middle East, when you look at the top 1% income share, I'm talking about income only. I'm not talking even about total wealth of an individual. The top 1% in the Middle East own 30% of the total income of the country, which is a higher proportion than what we see in South Africa or in Brazil. So these are figures recent by 2020. So this is probably the most unequal region in the world, and I'm talking about nationals only here. When you look at Saudi Arabia, for instance, the top 10% of the country, of the nationals, own something like 55% of the total wealth of the country. And it's even more in a country like Qatar, 57%. So extremely high disparity between nationals when you look at the top 1% or the top 10%. Another major problem, of course, I won't go into details, is the impact of climate change. These are, dry, extremely dry and arid regions, generally speaking. And the problem is that the question of water scarcity and water shortage is even more problematic nowadays. There are problems of increased desertification. There are problems of pollution, obviously. Extremely rapid urbanization impacting fertile lands. The very small proportion of fertile lands are impacted by rapid urbanization. And another element which is important is that due to the increased expenditures of these countries, they have more and more difficulties to balance their budgets, their state budgets. So when you look, there are plenty of criticism about this index, but it's quite an interesting index, the fiscal break-even oil price. So basically, the price of the barrel of oil that is necessary for a country like an oil producer to balance its own budget. And we can see that in Saudi Arabia, at the moment, the price that is needed for the is $70 a barrel to balance the Saudi budget. So at the moment we are talking about, the price of the barrel is around $80 a barrel, but it has been fluctuating quite a lot for 10 years. So, we have in mind a country which supposedly, has a lot of oil resources and extract it very, with a limit, at a very cheap cost and so on. Yeah, that's right. But they need a $70 barrel on the global market in order to balance their own budget. Otherwise, they run a deficit. And Saudi Arabia has been running a deficit for 10 years. So, in order to palliate these problems, do I have 10 minutes or? Okay. There are a few measures that have been implemented. The first one, and that's a buzzword for decades. This is the idea of economic diversification. This idea that by diversifying economy away from the oil rent or the oil, or at least balancing the revenues of the state, and relying not anymore only on oil, the economic structure of the country will change, and then unemployment will be reduced, more nationals will be employed in new sectors, and so on. So there are a few successes, we cannot deny that. One of them is the Dubai Ports World Company. Dubai Ports World is the company managing ports. It's the 5th largest port operator in the world, after a Singaporean, 2 Chinese and a Dutch one. So, Dubai has been quite successful at that. Other successes like the airlines. We know about Emirates, we know about Qatar Airways. They are very profitable and successful airlines. Another one is the question of, I don't know if you went to a country in the Middle East, but a very, very famous dairy industry food company is Al-Marai. Al-Marai is a Saudi company, which is quite fascinating because this is a dairy. They are producing dairy products, milk, and all other products in a country which is, very arid. And this company has been extremely successful and has invaded most of the region in terms of dairy products. You can find, this dairy product company has become the first one in Egypt, for instance, while Egypt has been, of course, for centuries, a country of production of agricultural products. So there are a few examples. And of course, telecommunications. Etisalat, you may have heard about it, of course. Etisalat has become the largest shareholder of Vodafone company, so the British one. Etisalat is an Emirati company, and it's the first company for mobile network in Morocco at the moment, the second in Egypt, the fourth in Nigeria and Pakistan. And the same with Ooredoo in Qatar, which has become the first in Tunisia, the third in Algeria, and so on. So there are a few successes. And of course, we cannot talk about successes without thinking of sovereign wealth funds. You probably know what is a sovereign wealth fund. This is an investment fund which is owned by a state. So they are usually composed of the state savings, the balance of payment of fiscal surpluses. And when you look at the sovereign wealth funds in the world, the highest one is Norway, which is the Norway Government Pension Fund. It's evaluated to $1.3 trillion. So it's a huge amount that is invested by Norway for future generations. The idea is to save and to invest for future generations. But when you look at the ranking in the world, you have the Abu Dhabi one, which is evaluated to $1 trillion. The Kuwaiti one, the Saudi one, the Qatari one. So these bodies, these funds are extremely powerful, and they are investing worldwide. One of them is, just the example of Qatar Investment Authority, the one that probably we know the most in France. It's evaluated to be something like, controlling $500 billion of assets. And it had stakes in the Volkswagen Group, 10%. It is the second shareholder in one of the world's largest commodity trading and mining company, Glencore. It owns Harrods, of course. It owns the second largest grocery shop and supermarket chain in the UK, Sainsbury's. It's a main shareholder of British Airways. And interestingly, it's the second biggest shareholder of Heathrow Airport itself. And I'm talking about London here, but we can talk about Paris, obviously. It has a huge amount of real estate properties in London, like the Shard, like the Olympic Village, Canary Wharf, and so on. So these are, and we can say that the same with Germany, with France, with other countries in the world. So what is the, sovereign wealth funds are as economic tools as political ones, and they're probably even more political tools than economic ones. Because what is the point for Qatar Investment Authority to invest in all these assets? This is basically a life insurance for Qatar or for other sovereign wealth funds. Because the idea is to say to, let's say, the UK in this case, look, we own so many key assets in your economy, so the airport, the main supermarket chain, plenty of assets in the real estate, that let's imagine that the Qatari ruling family is overthrown tomorrow. All these assets will be in massive danger, and your economy will be directly affected. Because let's imagine that a new ruler in Qatar decides to completely change its investment in priorities. They will withdraw their money from all these assets, and your economy will massively be impacted. So that's a fascinating life insurance tool for the ruling families, not the countries, but the ruling families, when they talk to other foreign actors, by telling them, you have all interest in supporting us and in making sure that we remain in power, because we are also here to make sure that your economies are benefiting from petrodollars and from all our investments. So these are kind of some successes, but there are structural weaknesses, and Dubai is the best example of it. The Dubai model, many people have been talking or were talking about the Dubai model for a lot of time by saying that that would be a new way to develop countries on the model of Singapore or other countries in the world. But it's extremely vulnerable towards the international environment and international context. We know that, for instance, in the 2008 financial crisis, Dubai was massively impacted because a very limited part of the Dubai economy takes place actually in Dubai. It is related to tourism, international tourism, but it's related to import and export of goods and services worldwide. So Dubai is a hub of import and export. So as soon as there is a financial crisis, and then as soon as the global economy is facing a major problems, then Dubai is directly impacted, proportionally. And the same happened during the COVID pandemic in 2020, when basically the economy of Dubai collapsed drastically. And ironically, this is a good example. You know the Burj Khalifa, which is the main tower in Dubai, which is still the symbol of Dubai. originally, it was supposed to be called Burj Dubai, that is the Tower of Dubai. But because of this financial crisis, Dubai, collapsed financially, and they had to resort on the oil resources of their neighbor Abu Dhabi, who decided to inject massive amounts of money in Dubai, in the Dubai economy, and to rescue the Dubai economy. And the Abu Dhabi ruler said, okay, we are rescuing you, but there is a price for that. And what's the price? We have to change the name of the tower, which is your symbol of success, by my name as a ruler. And Burj Khalifa is the name of the ruler of Abu Dhabi. So that's a massive, humiliation for Dubai when they had to change the name of the symbol of their success and adopt the name of the neighbor's ruler, just to show that they would have not been surviving without the neighbor, politics of rescuing them. Since, for the last 10 years, we've seen major national visions taking place. So all countries have developed national visions, and it's another tool that a number of these monarchies have tried to use in order to face all the challenges that I mentioned before. All countries have had national visions, and the most important, the most famous one is the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia. Everybody has been talking about it. I will not go into too many details in that, but I will finish by saying that, first of all, with all these visions, the new cities and the new mega projects, the new real estate projects and mega cities are key elements of these new visions in all these narratives and in all these projects. An example is, you may know that Egypt has been building a new capital outside Cairo, so halfway between Cairo and the Suez Canal. A new administrative capital has been built, or is being built, in Egypt at the moment, and that's part of the vision of Egypt for the future. But there are plenty of question marks around that, obviously. And in Saudi Arabia, we talk about NEOM, which has been we've talked a lot about in the news. The initial project was to have an estimated cost of $1 trillion. It would take 50 years to be completed. So the plan was to build it by 2070 or so. And the idea was to have 120 kilometers of buildings, 2 lines of 120 kilometers next to each other, separated by 500 meters, right? And so 2 lines in the desert like this. And that was, that's a project called The Line, right? So these are pictures that were taken 2 years ago about the construction of these lines in the middle of the desert. And these are the plans that, the image that are presented in the official documents of Saudi Arabia. Just 6 months ago, there were news about the fact that due to the financial problems that Saudi Arabia has been facing, they have had to reduce the size of these lines from 120 kilometers to 2.5 kilometers, right? More substantially, there are many question marks about these visions, and I will finish on this. The first one is that it's a case of déjà vu in many cases. So these visions are drafted by the same international consultancy agencies, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, that had already written reports 20 years ago, 30 years ago about the same reforms to be implemented. And these reforms led to the Arab uprisings. So in many cases, that's fascinating. You can copy and paste reports by a difference of 20 years or 30 years, and you'll see that the same recipes are advocated by these international consultancy agencies. So as a professor from Harvard explains, Rosie Bshir, she explains, it either promises more of the same or cosmetic changes to long-standing structural problems in a system that has long privileged white-collar expatriates. Average Saudi Arabians are not the target of these reform initiatives. They would continue to suffer high unemployment rates, the erosion of social safety nets, deteriorating living conditions, and US-supported authoritarianism. So their primary audience for the national visions are not the locals, they are not the Saudis, but they are usually, or a narrow segment of them, which are urban, very educated, higher middle class, who will benefit from jobs created by these visions, but a lot of the West. So Western countries and Western companies who have an interest in investing in this major development and major project, and which are massively benefiting from these contracts of consultancy, of services, of construction, of plenty of things. You cannot imagine the number of lawyers, of lawyer company from London who have a direct interest in this Vision 2030 or others, because they are directly benefiting from contracts about related to these new plans. We'll probably talk about that in the discussion, but contrary to the objective of wide-range transparency and accountability, it has gone, I mean, in Saudi Arabia, but in other countries, with an unprecedented concentration of money and political power. Because, again, most of these contracts related to these visions, the construction contracts and others, are granted to the same business elites or same companies that already benefited and that were already close to the rulers, but sometimes even to the rulers themselves, right? And so there is no reason why the deepening concentration of wealth and power, which will not fuel popular frustrations that it had fueled already before 2011 during the Arab uprisings, when people were already complaining about the concentration of money and power in the same hands. And I think, I mean, one sentence, I would like to quote a novelist. You probably heard, I mean, you know The Leopard, the novel, which was written in 1958 by Giuseppe di Lampedusa, which is about, it's a political novel which chronicles the changes in Sicilian life and society during the unification of Italy in the 19th century. And it's about how a political leader wants to remain in power, but has to implement reforms, but in order to stay in power and to show that things are changing. So to show the population that, look, we are changing and we are evolving, so it's not absolutely not static. And so there is a fantasy quote, which is, everything must change so that everything can stay the same and we can remain masters. And that's, in many ways, what happens at the moment with these visions. These visions are here to promote a vision or a perspective, both locally and globally, that things are changing, things are modernizing and so on, or things are evolving, but in fact, with the end goal of keeping the same situation as it is, with the control of political and economic powers in the same hands. And that's, yeah, I finish here. Thank you very much.